Let's talk about cheap headphones or budget headphones, consumer headphones, whatever you want to call them. But I'm going to talk about my main frustration with most inexpensive consumer headphones as compared to more professional studio monitoring headphones like the Sony MDR7506, my Shure SRH440s, or even my Beyerdynamic DT770 headphones. Granted, these are made for more of the professional world. Some of them have a higher price tag, but sometimes we just may need a cheap pair of headphones. But I find that the low price of cheap headphones usually isn't worth it for me. And I will preface this video with the fact that we all hear a bit differently, and hearing can certainly be subjective, assuming we don't have any major hearing issues. But some people do have hearing issues, and that's okay. I've actually had my share of hearing issues the past few years. So we may need to compensate for hearing deficiencies with equipment that can maybe provide more or less in a certain frequency range. But assuming we're talking about having a somewhat normal hearing response, let's talk about cheap headphones, because I've tried many different models, and I'll talk about why I wanted to find a cheap pair, which pairs I've tried, and how I may have found a decent pair from an unlikely source in the headphone market. Also, real quick, anytime in this particular video where I reference the Shure SRH440 headphones, what I'm actually talking about and what I'm showing are the Shure SRH440A headphones. I just made a little vocal flub. I forgot to say the A on the end of the headphones, but again, I'm talking about the Shure SRH440A headphones anytime I'm talking about those and showing them in this video. Sorry. All right, so I'm going to talk about a few different models of consumer and inexpensive headphones, and I chose some that were, no name or not very well-known brands, and I chose some from more established brands like Sony and Tascam. Of course, remember, there are almost endless brands and models out there, but I was looking for a cheap pair that met a certain set of criteria, and those criteria were: number one, something I wouldn't mind throwing around in a road case, something that I wouldn't mind letting clients or recording technicians use, something that was easy to grab and use. Number two, I really wanted something more compact than the Sony MDR7506, something that folded up if possible, because the Sony MDR7506s are the most compact pair of professional headphones, and they're still only about $80 brand new. So they were already hard to beat in terms of price and size and sound quality, but compactness was not a huge factor in this cheap headphone test. I was most concerned about budget and sound quality. Number three, they had to come in at under $40 a pair, because again, I was wanting something that was less expensive than the Sony MDR7506, because if I couldn't find a cheap pair, I might as well just buy more 7506s. Number four, I wanted wired headphones. No wireless connectivity was needed, because I'm generally using these headphones plugged into headphone jacks of various gear like video recorders, audio recorders, cameras, audio mixers, or even laptops, and I needed to be able to move the headphones around to different devices quickly. And wireless or Bluetooth options probably would have inflated the cost and been a feature that I didn't need or want. Number five, they needed to not have any inline microphones on the cable, because that would usually mean that they have TRRS plugs on the end with 4 conductors, which led to my next criteria of they had to have only TRS plugs, so just the tip ring sleeve, not a tip ring sleeve. Because depending on what you're plugging headphones into, sometimes TRRS plugs don't work well in jacks that are only wired for TRS or left-right ground. And since I needed to use these headphones in mostly analog audio gear, I found that some headphones with those TRRS plugs just didn't always pass the audio properly. And that became very apparent when using 1/8 inch or 3.5 millimeter extension cables. I'll use these a lot on equipment so that I don't have to always reach up to the equipment and plug the headphones in there. I'll put an extension cable on it so I can have the female end of the cable closer down to my desk, where I can plug my headphones easily, while the other end of the cable goes up and around to the back or the front of the equipment that's a little further away. So extension cables can be great as long as they're good quality, but some of those headphones with TRRS plugs didn't always work properly with extension cables. And the last thing was a pair of headphones that had as flat of a frequency response as I could get using my own ears and obviously my opinion about what is flat. but I tested enough cheap headphones to know when a pair was way too amplified in one area or conversely just way too lacking in one area. So I was just looking for as non-colored of a sound signature as possible. So I found and bought these models, and I should note I didn't realize some of these had TRS plugs before I bought them. Anyway, here are the models. These JBL Neon Folding headphones, I got these because they were 15 bucks. These JVC HAS31M, 20 bucks. These Tascam TH03, these were $40. The ever popular Sony ZX110, which are still under $20. These Panasonic RPHT161 with clear sound and XBS for extra bass. These were about $20 as well. These Philips 2000 series over-ear wired stereo headphones. These were about $18. And these fifine studio monitor headphones. These were about $35. All right, so I'm coming at this as a project manager for a live event production company, and I often need lots of matching pairs of headphones that are budget friendly and not overly colored in their frequency response, especially not overly bassy, which I'll get to, because I need these headphones for live event recording, so they need to be relatively flat, but with enough clarity and treble to hear what's going on. Budget headphones or cheap headphones are something that have frustrated me for a long time because most consumer headphones in the budget category are marketed as or try to have some sort of extra or deep bass, which can sometimes be lacking in smaller headphones with smaller drivers. But to me, most of the time, attempting to add bass just isn't implemented well. And these attempts at adding extra bass just makes most of these headphones sound muffled, like they removed or reduced the treble and just called it extra bass. And this is because, to my ears, the wrong bass frequencies are getting boosted on a lot of these consumer headphones. Most of these headphones have boosted bass somewhere between the 100 to 200 hertz range, and boosting that frequency range just makes things sound more woofy than bassy, and therefore just kind of muffled by comparison. And oddly enough, I've also come across some headphones that are completely the opposite, where the sound is just so thin and piercing that they're just unusable for me. One of those pairs I'll talk about here in a bit. It just seems that companies are intentionally making their budget line of headphones sound terrible so that you'll need to buy a more expensive pair. Too much low frequency boost or any overcoloration can lead to you not being able to hear the problems in your audio. And when using headphones for recording purposes, you really need to be able to hear if there are any issues. And a lot of those times the issues like distortion or clipping will occur audibly to our ears in the treble or higher frequencies first. And if our headphones sound muffled because they've reduced the treble or amplified the bass, you may not hear the problems in those higher frequencies. Anyway, all of this is why I have really only used professional headphones for probably the past 20 years. But again, sometimes we just need a pair of decent, inexpensive headphones that aren't overly colored and aren't so completely thin sounding that they just hurt to listen with. Okay, so that's my rant. It's over, but I think it's important to know that most consumer headphones are being audibly crippled for no apparent reason, because it stands to reason that if you can boost the bass, then you could just maybe not boost it as much and have a more true sounding pair of headphones, right? All right, so let's go through these headphones. First up, the JBL Neon Folding headphones. These are cheap and compact, which is why I tried them. The JBLs are on ear as well, fairly small cups actually, but they're fairly comfortable. But again, they do not go around your ear. They sit on your ears themselves, much like the Sony ZX110s. That wasn't a huge criteria. I was willing to get on-ear headphones if it came to that. The JBLs say they have crystal clear clarity. That is not the case at all. These had basically no treble. They were overly woofy, not really even bassy in my opinion. They're just muffled. And this again is the problem with most cheap headphones that I tried. And I didn't notice when I bought them, but they did have an inline microphone, which also meant they had that TRS plug. And this is also a pair that did not work well with a headphone extension cable. So these pretty much went back immediately. All right, next up, these JVC HAS31M headphones. These were basically the same as the JBL headphones, just overly woofy. They've either tried to boost the low end, but not to great effect, or they've just turned the treble down. Again, just muffled and woofy and just kind of muddy sounding overall. I get it, they're cheap, but I just don't think they should be over amplified in any specific area. I know manufacturers are trying to add bass, but I'd rather they just try to make something a little more flat, or at least with more treble, a little bit more high end. And this is also a pair that I didn't realize when I bought them had that TRRS plug. And although they don't have an inline mic, what that TRRS plug is for is so that you can plug these into something like a laptop and use the button here on the side of the headphones to control pausing and playing back of files or audio on your laptop. The ear pads do fold, so they lay flat, but they do not fold up and get any more compact than this. So JVC's TRRS plug, muffled, muddy, not too bad in the comfort area, but they're just not for me with that over muffled sound. Next, the Tascam TH03. These were the opposite of boosted bass. These were so thin, so tinny, piercing, mid-rangey. It was like they turned all the low frequencies below about, I don't know, 500 hertz completely down. And it was kind of like listening to some sort of, 1930s telephone. I mean, they went back in the box about 10 seconds after I put them on my ears. Personally, I just wouldn't bother. All right, next up, the Sony ZX110. Now, I've seen the ZX110 in a lot of places. Even Mr. Curtis Judd over on his channel recommended them as a cheap pair to let clients listen to audio on set. And I've seen enough of Curtis's videos to know that I trust his opinion. And I've really tried to like these, but overall, I just really don't like them because they too have way too much of that amplified bass boost, again, to me in the wrong frequency range. So they just sound woofy and muffled, or again, like the treble has been turned down. And of course, the Sonys are on-ear headphones. They do not go around your ear. They sit on your ear. You may or may not like that. They're lightweight enough that I don't think it really affects comfortability one way or the other. It's just something to note that they are on ear. Build quality is what you get for about 20 bucks. Build quality is not terrible. They are obviously plastic, but most headphones are. They're not going to withstand a lot of force pulling them. But in all the pairs I've used, I haven't seen a lot of breakage, so is what it is. The Sonys do fold up, and that's nice to make them a little more compact to fit in a more narrow spot in your bag. I like Sony as a brand, but to me, these are still just too bassy to be accurate for proper monitoring. Sorry, Sony. All right, next up, the Panasonic RPHT161. Again, these are also lightweight and inexpensive. You won't cry if you break them. They're over ear. Kind of. They fit over my ears. Mostly they don't sit on my ears, but they're pretty cheap feeling. They aren't angled. They actually kind of look completely symmetrical. And so when you put them on your head, they can feel a little bit uncomfortable, or like the front of the seals don't really seal around the front of your ear as much versus headphones that are angled. You can see here on these Shures, most headphones kind of have an angle to them so that they sit on your head more comfortably. Like that, which one's the left ear and which one's the right ear, but these Panasonics and most of these cheap headphones are kind of symmetrical, so none of them sit on your ears that well, but what are you gonna do for 20 bucks? These are actually not really bass boosted. They're not really woofy. They have more of a mid-range sound, between that maybe 400 to 1K mid-range boost, or conversely, just a lack of a little bit of bass and a lack of some upper mid-range. The ear pads on the Panasonics are decently padded, nothing to write home about. They're soft, but I also see that these are very similar to something like the Sony MDR7506, where this lining may start peeling off after a short period of time. They don't fold, the ear cups don't fold up, they don't fold in, so they are just the size that they are, but they are very lightweight. But overall, to me, these had just a little bit too much emphasis on the mid-range, so these also went back. Next up, the Philips 2000 series over-ear wired stereo headphones. Now, these are quite the opposite of almost everything on this list. These are actually missing some of those mid-range harsh frequencies. The bass is not woofy, it's actually a little deeper, like they didn't boost the wrong bass frequencies, and instead were able to boost the lower bass frequencies around that 80 hertz range. The bass is punchy and actually sounds really good, but the EQ curve on these sounds very much like the classic smiley face on a graphic EQ where all the mids are scooped out. And what that can result in is a decent pair of headphones for, casual music listening. They sound really good when you just put them on and listen to a good track. But I also know that what that can result in when you scoop out all the mids is ear fatigue after long listening periods. So these would be great just to keep at your desk for, again, casual music listening, but for longer listening periods and for live event recording may not be my first choice, but these actually are a little bit better for what I want to hear than a lot of these other pairs. Oh, and they kind of go around the ears. They don't really sit on the ears, but they are a little more narrow from the front to the back. So they're tall, but they're a bit narrow. Now they do mostly fit around my ears. They may not fit around yours. Buyer beware, and your mileage may vary. The Philips ear cups are actually quite nicely padded. They do have that same material like the Sony MDR7506s, which may peel off in the near future, but they are more padded than some of the others. They feel a little bit better on the ears. And the Philips do not fold up either. There's no turning of the cups. They don't fold in on themselves, so they are just kind of the size that they are. So after going through a few of the cheapest consumer options from bigger names like Sony, JVC, Tascam, and Panasonic, and finding that most of those headphones mostly just sounded muffled, I came across these fifine H8 headphones. Now, I would normally have just passed on these, mainly because they aren't from a very well-known company in the audio world, but I actually do already own a USB condenser mic from fifine as well, and I've even done a dedicated video on that very inexpensive, but actually very good quality mic. So I knew the brand a bit, so I went ahead and ordered these H8 headphones. These were an amazingly pleasant surprise. I put these on, and nothing sounded too much out of the ordinary. They didn't sound muffled, they didn't sound overly or artificially bassy, and they didn't sound piercing or thin, and the mids are present too. They're kind of warm and nice. There's less treble and less high end than the Sony MDR7506s or the Beyerdynamic DT770s, but to me, these have a relatively well-balanced sound. They don't seem overly amplified or overly lacking in any area to my ears. They're actually fairly flat sounding with a bit more of a low-end warmer sound, but I also felt like I could still hear everything I needed to. I listened to some of my favorite albums on these and was very impressed for these only being about $35. There's certainly no sort of high-end shimmer. Again, they're overall flatter sounding. I'll let you be the judge, but to me, they're decently balanced. And honestly, flat or flat-ish is exactly what I was looking for in a pair of headphones that were inexpensive, that I could buy a lot of copies of and distribute them to multiple rooms for a large corporate conference. You may not like them, but for corporate audio recording, these fifine H8s are going to let you hear more of what's going on in your mix rather than just sounding muffled like a lot of these other cheap consumer pairs. These seem to be a good pair that won't break the bank and have enough clarity to hear what's going on. To me, they don't seem to be another pair of headphones that's just trying to add bass. So we bought 12 pair of these for my last event, and they really paired pretty decently against the Sony MDR7506. Unfortunately, they failed my compactness criteria, but then again, so did most of the headphones on this list, because again, these also do not fold up in any way, shape, or form. The ear cups don't fold in like the 7506s. The ear cups also don't fold down or lay flat like the Shure SRH 440s. Again, these are also just the size they are, and that's what you get. The ear pads are actually fairly soft, and they go completely around my ears. The cups are a bit smaller, but they do encircle my ears and they don't sit on them. Even though the ear cups go around my ears completely, they aren't that deep, so I do find that the soft material just in front of the driver does touch my ears when the headphones are sitting on there, and that can get uncomfortable for longer periods of time, but I've worn these for at least an hour sitting in a virtual meeting, and I didn't really have that many complaints, but I can feel them hitting my ears inside the cups. And the ear pads seem to have a little bit more of a stronger material versus other materials like the cheap padding on the Sony MDR7506s, and even that similar padding on these Philips models. The padding on the fifines seems like it may last a little longer. It doesn't feel like it's going to peel and flake as much as some of these other models probably will. But overall, they are pretty comfortable. They don't come with a bag or case, but I did find a relatively cheap case that they fit in well for transport and protection, but now they're definitely not compact. But sound was more important than compactness in this case. They do come with two coiled cables, one that is a 3.5mm to 3.5mm TRS cable, and one that is a 3.5mm TRS to 1/4" TRS. I wish they would have just included an adapter to a adapt that from a 3.5 millimeter to a 1/4 inch instead of including an entire second cable that you have to switch to, but at least they do include options. And the connection on the H8 headphones is a standard 1/8 inch or 3.5 millimeter port right there on the headphones. And of course, the cable that plugs into that is a standard 3.5 millimeter TRS cable as well. Whereas more professional headphones like the Shure SRH440s have a detachable cable as well, but their cable and a lot of ones from Audio-Technica have a 2.5 millimeter cable that attaches on the headphone side, as well as, a somewhat proprietary locking mechanism that locks the cable in. And you can see here the size difference of the 2.5 millimeter cable on the left for the Shure SRH440s and the standard 3.5 millimeter cable on the right that comes with the fifine H8 headphones. Now, granted, on the other end of the 2.5 millimeter cable that goes with the Shure SRH440s, you have a standard 3.5 millimeter that can plug into any of your equipment and an adapter. It's just that connection at the headphones of some brands that is that smaller 2.5 millimeter connection. So if you break or lose those 2.5 millimeter cables, you can't just grab any cable that you may have in your bag and plug it in. Whereas with the fifines, you can use any standard 3.5 millimeter cable. So I can use the one it came with. I can use this shorter 3-footer if I want, or I can use a longer one because any 3.5 millimeter cable will plug in and work just fine on these H8s. And as a bonus, they kind of have this little smiley face guy here on the side to know that it sounds good. It's a bonus, but it's cute. And I still like the sound of these headphones. So that's my cheap headphone testing and review and what led me to these somewhat no-name brand of headphones, the fifine H8s. And I say no-name again because most of us, especially those of us that work in audio and live event production, primarily look to the major audio companies for equipment like Sony, Shure, Audio-Technica, etc. But when looking for budget headphones, I found a lot of those companies, cheaper or consumer models, still suffered from either too much fake bass that just sounded muffled, or in the case of the Tascam TH03s, the exact opposite, where they just sounded thin and very harsh. I was just disappointed at not being able to find a decent pair of cheap headphones that didn't have some over-amplification of muddy, muffled bass. Again, if you can boost a frequency, just maybe don't boost it as much and give us something a little flatter. Give us something like the Sony ZX110 in terms of foldability and compactness, maybe with a flatter frequency response, or dare I say it, less bass. I'm not expecting audio gold, I'm just expecting something that's not completely misrepresentative of the audio. And I think that's where most consumer headphones do the consumer wrong, because if your headphones are overly or artificially bassy, you or your client may think there's too much bass, maybe in the dialogue or vocal track, and then you may EQ it out when it wasn't really there to begin with, and possibly ruin your audio. So for now, it's the fifine H8s for my cheap pair of headphones. And that's my opinion, but my opinion comes from over 20 years of working in the field of live and recorded audio. This is what I do for a living, and I'm telling you, fake bass just isn't the right way to go most of the time. Unless it gets better or shifts the boosted frequencies down to a lower level, like maybe 80 Hertz instead of that 100 to 200 Hertz range, or just stop intentionally making cheap headphones sound bad. But until the audio companies do that, I guess I'll be here ranting about it. So, I'll see you soon. Later.